Okay, here we are, Spatial Shark, back with another quick video. This time we're talking about the Green Revolution, or the third agricultural revolution. Don't forget, your first agricultural revolution is the shift from hunting and gathering to farming about 10,000 years or so ago. And the second agricultural revolution, the mechanization of food production processes occurring in the late 1700s, early 1800s, along with crop rotation and new technologies to increase yields. So this third agricultural revolution starts around the 1950s. And this is the use of pesticides, chemical fertilizers, irrigation technologies, new and better machinery. But again, most importantly, it's a shift from subsistence type farming to commercial farming. Where has the impact really been felt? The yields have increased the most in Asia and in Latin America, not necessarily in the wealthiest countries, because we already grew a lot of food there, and certainly not really in Africa, because the crops that the Green Revolution really focused on, wheat, corn, rice, the big gigantic cereal crops that are the staples of so many diets in the world, Africa really doesn't grow those kinds of foods in the same quantities. African diets are much more based on things like millet, sorghum, cassava, peanuts, yams, or sweet potatoes. So a lot of other types of crops that the big, gigantic companies that have funded the Green Revolution really have not paid that much attention to in terms of research and development budgets, because there's just no profit in that. So that's an important thing to understand. Biotechnology, be careful, depends on the dates that they're giving you. There was an essay question way back in early 2001 about the Green Revolution, and it said only up until 1985. So you can't talk about biotech unless you start coming up into the modern day. So this idea of gene engineering or genetically modifying the food, that's a big part of the Green Revolution in biotech. Agribusiness, big companies funding this, again, like I said, with huge budgets. And of course, there is the resulting organic movement that has a role to play here, as well as people. Some people have said that the genetically engineered food is not sustainable and not healthy and could cause health problems. Of course, there's no evidence to suggest that any of these foods are causing people to be sick. Intensive farmers sometimes see a way to make money in the face of competition from gigantic corporate agribusiness farms by shifting to an organic movement. So again, we talk about food security, and this map is not super up to date, but generally speaking, Ethiopia, Somalia, the area of East Africa, is the area with the greatest food insecurity. And certainly we talk about the fact that the Green Revolution has not been as effective there. And this will give you an idea as well. Latin America, tremendous success with increasing food yields through biotechnology. China and India. India is now a food exporter rather than a food importer. Remember, these two countries have more than 1 billion people to feed. Certainly, there has been a lot of genetically engineered food being grown in North America, but remember, yields here were already really, really big. Two places in the world that have been kind of anti-GMO, for the most part, Europe, and especially in Japan, where laws are on the books that restrict the use of genetically engineered food. And of course, Europe tends to be a little bit concerned with that type of technology. Japan, even more so, most likely because of some issues even stemming from the end of World War II. Where Japan, of course, suffered at the end of the war with the United States and the atomic weapons. Japan just not really into this idea of the genetically engineered food. They'd rather it be whole and fresh and organic. And of course, Japan, rice is their big staple crop, and they've been successful conventionally growing rice. So when you think about the crops, and we mentioned rice, India has become a net food exporter. Yields are just doubling and tripling in some places where food was once scarce. You now have more than enough for people to eat. So when you think about the crop yields in the United States, definitely we already had high volumes of food being produced, but now farmers are getting hundreds and hundreds of bushels per acre. In terms of corn or soybeans. And of course, so much of our food is corn and soybean based. So in the United States, we have less farms today than ever before. There was a farm crisis in America in the 1930s. Excuse me, in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl conditions, the dirty 30s, they sometimes call them, and really people being foreclosed on their farms because of the Depression. That carries up all the way into the 1970s. And so less farms, but more food, as these farms are being taken over by these big corporate agribusiness entities. When you look at the impacts of the chemical herbicides and pesticides, insecticides, they can plant the plants closer together. The rows are closer together. Dwarf varieties of the plant, where the part that we eat is what grows the most. You've got plants that can now be more tolerant of shifts in temperature and in moisture. Nowadays, they have these irrigation systems that monitor. You can drop the water directly onto the root system. There's so many cool things that are going on with farming to increase yields. And of course, we've talked about the center pivot irrigation. And don't forget, any 4 of these fields here would be the equivalent of a square mile. And that's 640 acres. So each circle, approximately 160 acres. These are big, gigantic farms. Whereas you think about in the rest of the world, farm sizes usually average about a hectare if you're talking about poor countries, and that would be 3 acres. So this is farming on just a massive, massive scale. But again, you see that Africa has seen a modest increase in food. And again, this only takes you up into the 90s. This would have been really from 70 to 94, the real big push of the beginnings of this green revolution. 1970s, when Norman Borlaug wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his work saving about 1 billion people from starving. But look at the increase that you see in Asia, almost doubling output. Latin America, a tremendous increase as well. And again, these are cereal crops. So again, wheat, corn, and rice, right? So what does it take for the Green Revolution to work, to be successful? Well, obviously, you've got to have the water. Many areas of the world are being affected by drought. You have to depend on the technology. There has to be a cultural acceptance of this new way of farming. In some parts of the world, people are still farming the way that their grandparents and great-grandparents did, and so this is a cultural thing. So they have to be willing to change their technologies and their methodologies. Obviously, they've got to use the pesticides, chemical-based fertilizers. This is very expensive, of course. You have to basically accept that there's going to be reduced biogenetic diversity, because if you're using genetically engineered soybeans, all other types of soybeans are basically going to be phased out. Remember, you don't kill every bug, you don't kill every weed, and therefore there always has to be this constant fear that there's going to be some evolutionary resistance to the use of this new technology, superbugs, and therefore you still have to have the chemical spraying in addition to the genetically engineered, corn or soybeans or whatever it is that you're growing. So there is this questionable overall sustainability. And again, super, super expensive for the poorest countries. Where is that money going to be coming from? When we talk about reduced biodiversity, this is just a quick chart showing you how many different wild varieties of these different kinds of fruits and vegetables that there had been. And then yet you look 80-something years later, by the mid-'80s, we had whittled that down because, we don't grow the different varieties. We have started banking on just a few types of fruits and vegetables. And this brings us to this conversation about bananas. For the second time in human history, bananas are about to go extinct. The bananas that I ate as a child in the 60s and the early 70s, those bananas are not going to be here anymore. And that was the new banana at the time, because the previous banana had gone extinct. We also have issues with coffee. We also have issues with a lot of crops where, citrus greening that's happening right here in the state of Florida right now with the citrus farmers. And because we've become so dependent on these single type varieties and these monocultures, it makes it very, very, difficult when a disease gets into the plant or gets into the crop If you can't kill it and can't beat it, it can wipe out everything. So the banana farmers of the world are working, the big banana companies like Chiquita and Dole are struggling to come up with a new kind of different variety of banana that they can domesticate and create for human consumption. So this brings us all to these issues of social problems with the Green Revolution. We have more food in the world today than ever before, but of course we still have millions of people who are starving. So this isn't really a question of food production. It's a question of the distribution of the food. It's a question of income. It's a question of fairness, equity, and access. There's a great Hans Rosling TED Talk talking about, hungry people. As the men are migrating to urban areas, women are now doing more and more and more of the farm work, but yet they don't always own the land. The women are becoming more scientific farmers as they access agricultural extension services, learning about pesticide use, learning about irrigation, learning about the machinery, learning about the markets. The women are the ones who are, buying the seeds and selling the produce. And, so the roles of women in food production are changing. Women usually, in the old days, would be kind of at home. Now the women are out in the fields as the men have migrated looking for jobs in big cities and these islands of development across Africa. So there's still this dependency issue. The gap between the richest and the poorest countries is widening. Even in these poor countries, there are those who are extremely wealthy who own a lot of the land, and the small farmers become basically dependent wage laborers. In the United States, we have giant farm subsidies every year in Congress where farmers are being supported, and it keeps the food prices artificially low. The LDCs, they can't really compete with that. And again, when you saw, for example, in the coffee go-round, the farmers of the developing world don't get paid a lot from the food that you and I are eating. And then there's, of course, the questions about, for example, GMO labeling. Should the product be labeled that it's GMO? Obviously, companies want to label organic because that's a perceived benefit. Sometimes companies, I think they're scared to label because they think that the people are fearful of the so-called frankenfood. Should we be locavores? Should we be eating everything that's locally grown instead of having it shipped halfway across the continent or even halfway across the world? Urban vertical farming is now becoming a big deal. Community-supported agricultural gardens like we saw in Detroit. People becoming a little more vegan or a little more vegetarian and cutting back on red meat consumption. All of these are great social issues that we can talk about when we talk about farming. So when you go to the grocery store the next time, how do you know if a product is conventionally grown, if it's grown with pesticides and chemicals, or if it's organic? So this is a cool little slide here I found that talks about what the PLC code means, the barcode on the produce. And again, everything that's in the grocery store is going to have that country of origin. The meat has to tell you where it's from. The fruits and vegetables have to tell you where they're from. So next time you're in the store, don't touch everything, but, pick up a few items and see. And remember, artichokes, Castroville, California. If you want to have some fun, about 90% of all the artichokes consumed in the United States are grown in only one little town in California. It's Castroville. So here's where your organic farming is. And I want you to, again, think about patterns and processes. We've been talking about that since the first day of school. Do you see a political correlation between where the organic agriculture is and where people vote a particular party line? Clearly, the Northeast, the Pacific Coast, California especially, this area of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, these are areas that tend to vote left. They tend to vote liberal. And the states, the red states, the deep South, the southeastern United States, Texas, the Mountain West, this is where organic is generally not as heavily supported. And again, if they ever ask you this question on the exam, what's the single biggest restrictive factor to all Americans buying and eating organic? It's the cost of the food. The joke always is, yeah, you can go to Whole Foods, but you have to spend your whole paycheck. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. He's known as the father of the Green Revolution. If you want to search him up on Google, you'll find a lot of interesting little clips and quotes. My favorite one was the one from the movie Harvest of Fear, which talked about biotechnology, and it really kind of promoted this organic movement. And they interviewed Dr. Borlaug before his death. He died just a few years ago. There's a building named for him on the campus at Texas A&M. Obviously, Texas A&M, the A is agricultural. So he went to work every day in a building with his name on it, which is pretty impressive. But he said this organic movement is ridiculous. For those who want to go the organic route, God bless them. Let them spend more money for their food. But looking at the world at large, this is an impossibility. And then he started his temperature started rising, his blood pressure got up a little bit, and he started getting a little bit, cranky old man. He says, most of the people who are opposing biotechnology, they've never known hunger. He felt that these people were elitist. And he said, look, the people of the poor countries of the world, they don't have this social agenda about whether the food is genetically engineered or not. They're starving. He said that people want the little farmer to permanently accept he's going to stay on a little 3-acre farm. Remember, that's a hectare with a hoe and a machete. That's fine in utopia. And all you H2O paper kids, you should know the difference between utopian and dystopian society. He says, don't give the world the false idea that they can produce the food that's needed for 6 billion people. And of course, nowadays, we've added another China to the Earth's population since the time that he gave that interview, because now we're in excess of 7.5 billion people. So when you think about hunger, remember we talk about it's not about production, it's about distribution. More than, or I should say about 2/3 of all the world's hungry live in only 7 countries. So if you could get these countries to embrace green revolution technologies, to increase their yields, to grow more food, you'd go a long way to eliminating hunger, and it wouldn't have to be food aid from far away being shipped in. It'd be great if these countries were able to find ways to increase their yields domestically rather than depending on international help. Okay, there we go. That's the end of this little set. That'll be video number, I think that's number 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess 5. This will be the 5th one. 6th one coming up, we'll talk about U.S. farming. 7th one will be about the meat production in the United States and depending on corn. And then the final one will be plantation farming and all the luxury crops. See you soon.